Hello biology students. In this video we will be looking at the beginning part of Apologia Module 15A, and we'll be covering pages 463 to 471. And I would like to give some credit to my inspiration of VeggieTales, which has the best compilation of songs and stories about plants, and hope you can tap into some of their fun plant adventures. Alright, so in this particular module we are looking at what's considered plant physiology, and that is just another way of describing the study of life processes in an organism. And obviously for this chapter we're looking at the different life processes in plants. And so the first essential or critical component of plant life is definitely water. Water is required for a number of different processes in plants. The first being photosynthesis, where the plant uses water and carbon dioxide to make glucose. You probably remember this molecule, the C6H12O6. So water is essential for that. It's also used to establish the turgor pressure in plants. It allows plants to be supported, and that also allows it to respond to different stimuli in its environment through what we're going to look at in just a minute, the nastic movement. And so for a plant that is supported fully with turgor pressure, the vacuoles of each cell are full with water, you would see the plant standing upright. And then when the vacuoles are emptier, right, then the plant is wilting. Water is also important for hydrolysis, which happens when it breaks down starch, which is formed in the polysaccharides, right? That's many saccharides linked into chains, and they're broken down into smaller units called monosaccharides, which then can be available to use for energy. So that's an important function for water. And then in addition we have transport, that various materials are dissolved in water in the plant, and they can be carried up in the xylem cells, right, from the roots up to through the stems and the branches and the leaves. And we'll also be looking at this, the sense of transpiration of water vapor out of the leaves, then draws, it evaporates up in the leaves, but that evaporation will draw water up from the roots all the way through the plant. So these are just a nice summary of the importance of water in plants. Alright, so let's look at this concept of plant movement. So they're not talking about plants moving from place to place with like its roots moving throughout the soil, although I mean the roots are growing, but they're not saying like a plant gets up out of one spot in the soil and then migrates to another portion of the soil and then re-roots the same exact plant. What they're talking about here is the movement of a particular plant, that it has a response to stimulus such that in the nastic movement, for example, the direction of the response is just pre-programmed and not dependent on the direction of the stimulus. So in your book here on page 464, we're talking about, we're looking at this figure. It shows the leaves of this mimosa plant before it's been touched. You can see the leaves here. It's actually pretty hard to see, but they're laying flat. And then after some vibration or stimulus in its environment, right, then the plant closes up. It's responding to that. However, that is contrasted, for example, with tropism, that is a plant's response in the direction of a stimulus like light. So in this case, the leaves are growing in the direction of the light. In this case, the leaves were just folded up, and they would have reacted regardless of where the stimulus came from. In this case, they clearly are responding to the light that's in that direction. All right, so let's look at On Your Own, page 465. It says, if water is in short supply and a plant wilts but does not die unless the water stays in short supply for a long time, based on this, which of the 4 water-based processes that we discussed can be temporarily neglected? So the answer in this case is the turgor pressure, because the turgor pressure can be temporarily neglected in a plant. It can wilt for a certain time and then be revived by the addition of more water and not die, but obviously there's a limit within that. It can't last forever when it's severely wilted. All right, let's look at water absorption. So we know that water is absorbed mostly by roots. Only a small amount of water vapor can be absorbed through the stomata. Remember, those are the openings on the leaves. So even when it rains, even though leaves can collect water on their surfaces, they're definitely limited compared to the absorption of water that occurs through the roots. The roots are the primary source of water in the plant. Then we look at soil. So in soil we have 2 different types of components. We have both organic and inorganic. So the organic components would include things like molds, bacteria, protozoa, worms, and yeast, whereas the inorganic components include gravel, sand, silt, and clay, like the non-living components. And it's interesting because they have different size particles. So this is important to a plant, these different size particles, because of what's called the pore spaces that they create. So spaces in the soil that determine, the pore spaces are the spaces in the soil that determine how much water and air the soil can hold. So you can see up in this diagram here that these larger particles create a larger pore space than the smaller particles, which are sandwiched closer together. And so what's important here is that the larger the pore space, the more oxygen and carbon dioxide the soil can hold, which is important for the roots of the plant to have access to those gases. And then the book points out that loam is a nice mixture of gravel, sand, silt, clay, and even organic matter, which is good for plant growth. So perhaps some of you may have worked with loam if you've reseeded your lawn, or you like certain types of potting soil. Those are engineered, right, for optimal plant growth. All right, here's On Your Own 15.2. Some people think that putting plant roots underwater will allow the plant to absorb all of the water it needs. If you do this to most plants, however, it will kill them. Why? Well, the answer to this question primarily is that plant roots do need oxygen and, as we mentioned, carbon dioxide for respiration, and plants cannot absorb oxygen very well underwater. Therefore, putting them underwater deprives them of oxygen, and rice is an exception. But another exception to that is also that if you wanted to create new roots off a plant, you can take some cuttings from plants and they'll develop roots. But I guess they're limited in a sense that they wouldn't live underwater. The roots won't live underwater indefinitely. And then there's another form of plant growth called hydroponics, in which the plants are grown in water. However, they're aerated, so the oxygen is provided in the water, and other nutrients which help the roots to grow under those circumstances. All right, now let's look at water travel throughout the plant. And here we take on this concept of the cohesion tension theory that occurs in the xylem cells. So just to review, we know that transpiration is the evaporation of water from the leaves, and it causes water to move up the xylem in a plant. So the question in the book was, well, why does it move up like that? And this is a theory that has some validity right now, although I guess they explain in the book that they can see some flaws in the theory, and so it may change in the future. Maybe one of you will be researching it and find a better version of the theory. But for the time being, we look at these concepts of cohesion and tension in the water. So the cohesion shows that the water molecules, these individual molecules, are strongly attracted to each other. And so they form tension, right, through this cohesion, which is eventually a force that pulls up the water molecules in the plant. So as the evaporation occurs, well, even in any of the leaves, or in this case the needles of the plant, as that space occurs at the ends of the needles, it continues to draw up water all the way from the roots through the stems and eventually keep replacing the empty spaces in the leaves. So a question, or actually, sorry, not a question, this figure demonstrates the surface tension that water molecules can have through the visualizing how this insect, the water strider, can walk or just float on the top of the water because of the water molecules providing enough surface tension to allow it to stay afloat. All right, so we talked about how water has moved through the plant with the xylem cells. Here we're going to look at translocation, which is the way the phloem cells transport nutrients throughout the plant. So just to review, the translocation is this process. Since food is made in the leaves, it has to be transported to other parts of the plant. So it may have to be transported down even as far as the roots, since some plants store excess food in the roots. And the phloem is responsible to do this, and it must be live cells to transport the nutrients because they actually expend energy to do that. In contrast to the xylem cells, which when they're mature, they actually die, and then they simply provide tubes that the water flows through, but the phloem is living tissue that will transport nutrients in all directions throughout the plant. All right, let's look at On Your Own, page 469, 15.3. A botanist has two samples of liquid. Sample A is composed primarily of organic material, while sample B is composed mostly of water and minerals. Which liquid was extracted from the xylem of a plant and which came from the phloem? So these are our clues. We have organic materials in A and water and minerals in B. So we know sample A, because it had more organic material, came from phloem, and sample B came from the xylem because it would just had inorganic materials like water and minerals. All right, let's look at On Your Own, page 469, 15.4. It says, typically, a plant opens its stomata during the day and closes them at night. So here we have a rendering of stomata. This is supposed to be a closed stomata, and this is an open one. when would you expect transportation of water to occur, in the day or during the night? So our answer would be during the day when the stomata are open, because that's when evaporation is most likely to occur, and we know as the evaporation occurs, then water is transported up through the plant. All right, let's take a look at plant growth. So the plant growth occurs in this tissue called the meristematic tissue, and it's controlled by hormones. So hormones are just simply chemicals that circulate throughout any multicellular organism. So mammals have hormones too, but they're not the same as the plant hormones. And they regulate cellular processes by interacting with specifically targeted cells. So a hormone that is produced would be connecting with the receptors on specific cells in another part of the plant in this case. Now we know plants have 5 groups of hormones, and these are, actually they have 6 listed here because this one was sort of the mystery hormone. So we have auxins, gibberellins, cytokinins, abscisic acid, ethylene, and phlorogen. And so we'll look first at the auxins. So auxins primarily affect the length of a plant's stems, and they drive the response in phototropism. So photo would have to do with light. So that's growth toward light. Remember how plants will grow toward the light. And then gravitropism. This part is referring to gravity. In this case, it's growth opposite the center of the Earth's gravity. So it's when a seed is planted in the soil, it's growing away from the center of the Earth. And then we have thigmotropism, which is a response to touch. And scientists believe that auxins are destroyed by light. So here's an example, figure 15.3 of gravitropism. So they do know that auxins tend to concentrate on the bottom of a stem. If a stem has like a top and a bottom side, they see more auxins in this bottom side. So if a plant has been turned and the auxins have settled onto this bottom surface, then the cells on this side of the plant are going to grow faster than the ones on this inside. Imagine like a racetrack, right? They're coming around, and that will influence the plant's growth to be upward, and in this case closer to the light. And so that now we have this interesting concept of etiolation, and that is this extreme phototropism when a plant is in a dark area and the auxins create stem growth, so the stems are long, thin, and light colored. Now in this case they have the contrast of 2 plants growing. This is grown in light, so it has shorter stems and full leaves with green leaves, whereas the ones that were grown in the dark, right, they grow these long, thin, whitish stems, and their leaves are definitely lighter. So some of you might remember your radish experiment, with the ones that were grown in the dark definitely resembled those types of stems. Now without light the plant would eventually die, but it may just have enough light in this case to keep it going, or maybe eventually even this one may die. Then we have this other concept, as it was introduced in the previous slide, the thigmotropism. And in this, an example of this is when a vine grows around another structure. Now the explanation of this concept is that it looks like auxins tend to move away from the surfaces that a plant touches. So it will grow on the outside of the plant, causing it to bend around the structure that it's near. And that's what you might see vines like winding around, sort of like a corkscrew around another another object. All right, so let's look at explanation of some more plant hormones. We have the gibberellin family of hormones that promotes elongation in stems, and it increases the rates of mitosis and can induce seeds to germinate. Cytokinins affect mitosis rates and cellular differentiation, influencing production of chlorophyll and can induce leaves to elongate. Then we have abscisic acid. Inhibits the abscission layer of the leaf so it does not close off and controls the stomata. And we looked at that abscission layer in the leaf in our previous module when we looked at deciduous trees. Then we have ethylene, promotes the ripening of fruit and induces the abscission layer of leaves. It can even be used to ripen fruit after they are picked, which is kind of an interesting concept. And then we have this concept of florigen. It's currently being investigated to see if it's responsible for controlling flowering in plants. So if you want to go into some interesting research, you could look into that. And then just to point out that animals also have hormones that control growth and development. All right, let's look at On Your Own, 15.5. Regardless of how you plant a seed, the seedling always sprouts up through the soil. What growth hormone is responsible for this? So the answer here is auxins. So they are responsible for the gravitropism, the fact that the seedling doesn't grow farther down into the soil, but it would grow up so it can emerge from the soil. They are responsible for the seedling sprouting in the right direction. All right, 15.6. You see a bean plant that has grown abnormally long and is more yellow than green. What is the most likely reason for this bean plant's appearance? So again, here we have the one plant with the shorter stalk and the larger green leaves, and the other plant, this was grown in the light. The dark has the longer stem, whiter stem, and lighter leaves. And so we know what happens here is when the plant doesn't get enough light and is showing signs of etiolation, the yellow color indicates that it has low levels of chlorophyll in the leaves. All right, so our next slide, our next unit, our video will be on this. And for the meantime, I'll leave you with the encouragement to look up some fun VeggieTale songs if you have time.